Hey there, everyone. Average Joe here. I just want to jump in before you listen to the episode and apologize. We're a little rushed getting this episode out, and Beef Pork Ribs was using a computer where his audio just did not come out very well. So I apologize in advance. He's going to sound a little rough today, but we had a really great conversation, and hopefully you'll be able to enjoy it.
My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
By sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds or geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Pound. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic multiverses, mega Christmas, strangest franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
Year after year after year.
That's right. So even though it is now Valentine's Day at the time of our recording, we have yet to really take a look back at the last year and just figure out how we feel about it after the fact. So I know for most people, 2020 or 2020 is kind of still leaves a bad taste in your mouth because it was a really hard year for a lot of people and the whole world changed, and we're still living a lot of those changes now. But Beef Pork Ribs, it is good to hear your voice, and I've found out in the past week that Zencastr is kind of transitioning to a video-based version instead. So, starting next week, we might actually end up like seeing each other as we're air quotes seeing each other as we record.
Ooh, video podcast. Well, that'll make the YouTube videos a little more interesting, right?
I don't know. I guess like we could do that. For people who care about this sort of thing, generally the videos that go on YouTube is basically just a conversion of the audio recording. So in theory, yeah, we could put the actual videos of us talking. I get the feeling, though, if you're going to use YouTube to listen to our show, it's because you just want to listen to it on one tab while you're doing other things. So I don't know if they're really going to be the kind of people who actually want to look at us. But I'm also, just to acknowledge for anyone, I'm probably going to be a little distracted. Oh, order complete. Hang on a second. It should be there. I ordered sushi for Valentine's Day, and the DoorDash guy apparently has just delivered it. So I'm just letting my housemate know that it's there.
What a coincidence. I'm also planning on having some sushi, though selectively certain sushis, being as Mjolnir is still pregnant.
I don't think the listeners of the show have been made aware of that yet. Are you comfortable exposing that secret? It's not really a secret, that factoid to our audience.
Well, I mean, we were going to talk about what we thought of the year 2020, and I was going to give it somewhat of a positive review for two reasons, and that's one of them. So perhaps I jumped the gun a little bit, but yes.
Well, let's just start there. Yeah, positive things that happened in 2020. So, Beef Pork Ribs, you've kind of alluded to this, but share your news.
I first off, I got married, which was great. I also moved halfway across the country without dying, despite COVID, which was a good accomplishment, I think. And my wife got pregnant, so can't really complain that much about the year. I mean, it sucked, but those are probably some of the greatest things that will happen to me in my life. So I can't really give such a bad rap to the year after all.
Very good points. Yeah, the whole, I was fortunate, unlike some who lost work or lost jobs because of the shutdowns. I was able to work from home, and then even come August and September, I was actually able to start working from the office again, and it was an interesting 6 months there or so, kind of like working all from home, and we've had to do a bit more of that recently, and it looks like things are opening up a bit more again so that we'll actually be able to work from our office again. But at least now it's like mentally, I know what the experience of working remotely from home is like. And I know what to anticipate and what that routine looks like. So it's less foreign than it was a year ago. And it is hard to believe it. We're coming up on 1 year in March since the real global, the global pandemic for COVID-19 started.
Yeah, I mean, I also kept working. It definitely was a lot different last year when suddenly we left for March break, and then through March break, we're told at first we were told that it was just the March break was going to last 2 weeks, and not to give the kids any homework, and to forget about all that because we'd be back just a week later and transition right into nope, everything is online until the end of the year. But in spite of that, I did not lose my job as well, and I got a new one even, which was pretty amazing, which also allowed me to do part online and part in person, which I'm very thankful for.
Yeah, and for our podcast here, it's been a very interesting year as well. We hit our 4-year anniversary in October, and shortly after we hit our 200 episode milestone, which is, I would say, significant just because, not every podcast makes it 200 episodes. And we, of course, owe that entirely to everyone who's continued to keep listening because, if no one was listening, we would have stopped. So if you're listening right now, thank you very much for continuing to support our show. And because COVID started and because we were all encouraged to like stay home unless you absolutely had to, we had to start looking for alternatives for recording. So we started using Zencastr as an online tool. And if you're looking to start a podcast, I would highly recommend using Zencastr as a platform for doing it because it makes the whole process very simple to have people kind of recording remotely from each other. And, Beef Pork Ribs, you and I had already talked about the possibility of, you becoming a remote co-host for your moving. And, the pandemic kind of just forced us to get ready for that.
Yeah, we got to trial run it while we were both still in Ottawa, and now we knew it was going to work, and it's been working quite well, I think, and has also allowed us to expand the podcast. I think it's been a lot easier to get guest stars. Not that you had any particular trouble finding people to talk about nerdy things. We know a lot of nerdy and geeky people, but I feel like I think it also gave an opportunity. I know Ben the Movie Buff was on quite a bit, especially when he wasn't working as much, and other people weren't working, who haven't been working as much, have participated more. So I think and I think that that's not just us, but I think that's something else that 2020 has been kind of a golden time for podcasters. A lot of podcasts have expanded, appeared, and become more common, and have become kind of this. Like I know yourself as well as my wife are, avid listeners to the Weekly Planet broadcasts or the Great Mates and all the other. I don't remember exactly what the name of the entire platform is, but they seem to have multiplied the amount of podcasts they create as well. So good year for podcasts.
And it's ironic because I find, especially since I'm not commuting anymore, I'm listening to far fewer podcasts. So I've actually like dropped a number of podcasts that I used to listen to, but I'm slowly making my way through the podcast that I listen to personally because I'm again not commuting or going nearly as many places. So I'm kind of reserving my podcast listening for eating meals by myself or doing chores around the house or that kind of thing. And it's true. We definitely got the opportunity to bring in a lot more guests this year. People might not realize, but before COVID, when we'd have a guest on the show, we had to like really align everyone's schedule so that everyone could gather in our studio space for recording. And, and basically meant A, you had to live in Ottawa where we were. And 2, you had to like, depending on where you lived in the city, it involved like 20 or 25 minutes of driving, kind of congregating in one space and then getting everything recorded and then getting them out the door before they had to be somewhere else. And it often involved me actually like taking all the equipment to someone else's house to set up and do the recording with a guest. So yeah, this has made it so easier because people can just jump in from wherever they are. And admittedly, the overall production quality is lower because not everyone has professional or semi-professional microphones on hand. But I think we've had a lot of really fun conversations. Like I think of the D&D episode we did, there were like 6 of us. In the Lord of the Rings episode, there was like 5 or 6 people. And even the one with the Umbrella Academy, there was like 5 of us talking about the show.
And I think also, if you're ever looking for different ways to listen to your podcast, I mean, I have a quote unquote commute. I walk to work, but going on walks, good for your physical health, good for your mental health, because it's one of the few things you can still do under COVID. Find a place. Well, not everybody. If you're landlocked and in a city, it might be a little bit harder. But finding a nice place to go for a walk, listen to our podcast, catch up on it, find a new one.
Yeah, and my relationship with nerd and geek culture really changed in 2020 because, as people may remember, at the start of last year, I was participating in a program called Exodus 90, where I wasn't watching any TV or movies, and my overall consumption of media was just much, much smaller. I wasn't even checking out news sites. So I was totally kind of like in the dark as to what was happening in pop culture. And then when that was over, it was Easter and it was April, and so I was kind of just catching up on everything that I'd sort of missed while I was away. And of course, when the pandemic started, everything started getting stalled and delayed. And uh, I also just started watching less TV and movies than I used to. I'm trying to just create more space for other things. So we're going to talk about some notable movies and TV shows that came out this year. And admittedly, I have not seen a lot of them because I've just, again, spent less time watching TV and movies this year. But I will say 2020 seemed to the year I finally got around to watching some shows that I'd heard lots of good things about, including Avatar: The Last Airbender, Star Wars Rebels, and Cobra Kai. Those are all things I kind of finally got into in 2020, and I enjoy them all very much. And I'm sure they'll all, I mean, we've already found ways to incorporate Rebels into the podcast, but I wouldn't be surprised if Avatar or Cobra Kai becomes an episode at some point as well.
Have we not done an episode about Avatar: The Last Airbender?
No, it's been brought up a couple times, I think, but it was mostly from my not having watched it, and just not, feeling like I'd have, and I did feeling I wouldn't have much to say. I guess it's in the jar for
We
sure.
should add it to the bad jar now that you have seen it. I think it's worth something.
But yeah, thinking about 2020, and we're talking about nerd and geek culture. It is ironic that we spent the first chunk of the year kind of recounting all the movies and TV shows and video games and anime that had come out in the previous decade, because as we've said many times, 2020, a lot of stuff that was supposed to happen didn't happen. Movies got delayed, and some of them still don't have a defined release date. TV shows got delayed, and some of those have not come out yet. And so it's just funny. And there are a couple of things, I guess, notable that happened this year. And Beef Pork Ribs, I'll be curious to hear if this matters to you or not. But the movie Parasite, which is a film from South Korea, won the Oscar for Best Picture last year. And apparently that's the first time in history that a non-English language film won the Academy Award for Best Picture.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard only good things about that movie, so I would assume it deserved it. But that is, but that also has this kind of strange thing where I don't know if that has happened, but I feel like with more people, I feel like we're in, probably, or you and I, but mostly you, because you said you reduce your consumption of media, kind of in the minority. Most people, I feel like, we look at all the subscription to streaming website have just been skyrocketing and going up and up throughout the whole pandemic. I feel like I wouldn't be surprised that more people did start maybe looking into alternatives and looking into, more foreign films. Although, then again, streaming platforms tend to not have as many as domestic titles. So I don't know how that goes. But yeah, that's definitely, I think, big news, but at a poor time because, the movie industry is in a weird decline right now, but it might not last.
Yeah, you make a good point. I'm definitely in the minority. I think most people definitely increased their overall TV and movie consumption in 2020. And we'll get to that when we talk about some of the shows that became popular this year. Something that we talked about many times on the show was this kind of development of the online fan convention, because Comic-Con and anime conventions and E3 for video games were kind of landmark events that happened every year that the whole fandom, the whole communities would gather around and congregate to. And of course, with COVID canceling all large scale events, everyone kind of had to pivot to doing online conventions. And we've we've had episodes like talking about specific ones that happened. And if I remember BPR, I don't think you ever actually attended any of them.
No, but to be fair, I only attended my first anime convention in the summer of uh 2019, I suppose. Like just before, or 2018. I can't remember, but I'm still relatively new to even just the con scene. Personally, I always thought I wasn't enough of a nerd to justify spending that kind of time and money on those kind of events. But no, I haven't actually participated in any of the online ones.
Yeah, I've been to a couple of them, and people who've been listening to the show know my thoughts on the ones I've gone to. It obviously is not the same as being in person, but I think the big thing that I got away from those fan experiences, it was a reminder that what I was experiencing in terms of staying at home and living with COVID-19 as a reality was being experienced all over the world. And there was kind of that kind of congregating of like, yeah, like we're all kind of dealing with the same things and it's all hard. And, I'm sure other people had other things that perhaps kind of created that sense of community for them, but certainly the online conventions did that for me.
Although to be fair, I am going to participate in an online convention next week as I'm a teacher, and in Alberta every year they have the Alberta Teachers Association convention, which is happening online. So I will get a little bit of that experience. We'll see if it's comparable.
Fair enough. So does it matter to you that the PlayStation 5 was released in 2020? Because that seems like that's kind of like the first console of like the next generation of video games.
Yes and no. I mean, I've never cared that much about Sony's station, like Sony's gaming platform, and the PlayStation has never been part of my childhood or part of what I've particularly personally enjoyed playing. I think my main interest in it is seeing how consoles start to kind of, I feel like there is a shift that is happening, but I don't know if that's maybe my personal bias because I'm primarily a PC gamer. But I feel like consoles more and more are basically just specialized computers, and that PC gaming just does more things and does them just as well as a console, you know, maybe on a bigger screen. But a lot of people are using their computer screen as TV screens instead. So I don't know if it's actually. I'd be interested in seeing how that develops because, and it might reinforce my opinion that you need to be like Nintendo and be original and have something that's more than just better graphics and better sound in order to make it in this market now.
Yeah, not a gamer, so I don't have much to say. I do find it interesting though. There was an Avengers video game that came out in 2020 and it actually did terribly. And you would think, coming off of the heels of Avengers Endgame being the highest grossing movie of all time, that a video game based on the Avengers would have actually like been much more successful.
I mean, but there is something to be said, and which Mjolnir keeps repeating about how the MCU has become a lot more about character development and trying to get these massive stories happening, which I think is the bigger part, especially of things like Endgame and Infinity Wars. It was kind of this big build up, and I feel like a video game on that theme just doesn't have the same weight to it. I feel like if you were going for the equivalent in video games, it would be more sequels to games that were done before, or like series ending or rebooting. Something like having the next installment of Final Fantasy not sucking, or having a reboot or a new installation for, I don't know, Devil May Cry or some other game that has a bit more of a following would be more equivalent. Whereas just stamping on successful movie isn't so much, and never really has been equivalent to a successful video games. I mean, think of all the terrible like video games they made about certain movies, like the ET video game, notoriously one of the worst that was ever made. You're just trying to bank off of one commercial success without necessarily putting the effort in for a good final product. It can only go so far.
Yeah, from what I understand, it's not an adaptation of the MCU. It's just a Marvel game that's based on the Avengers. But you're right. All I have to say, as a DC person, it kind of honestly makes me a little happy to find out that there's something that Marvel isn't perfect at, because they've generally got their act together in every other arena. And video games, I would probably say, is like maybe like the only thing that they're able to seemingly not do as well as DC Comics does.
To be fair, though, the Spider-Man games have been doing really well, and like the Lego Avengers or Lego's Marvel games do quite well. So I mean, there's a bit of, I think there's some leeway there, but I mean, I don't think anything Marvel has ever done has hit the same level as like Arkham or Injustice. So yeah, go good for DC on still, if not perfecting it, at least being better than Marvel.
We didn't really talk about this earlier in the year, but 2020 saw for the first time web comics from made in Korea adapted into Japanese anime. And it's fitting because Libra the Book Lady, who has been on the show recently about The Mandalorian, she's mentioned Webtoon on here before. And Webtoon, if you don't remember, is a online web comic platform where basically artists can essentially upload their own content for people to read. And some people upload weekly like a manga, or monthly like an American comic book. And so for the first time in 2020, there were actually a couple instances where web comics drawn and created by people in Korea and then translated into English for people over here were picked up by Japanese studios to be made into anime. Does this matter to you at all, Before Gribs? Like, is it just a fun bit of trivia to know that we're starting to get anime based on things that are not entirely all Japanese?
I mean, a little bit. Like, Manhwa being adapted into animes was a big news, but I think also has to do with like a lot of them were very popular. And I do think also like there was a bit of a precedent in the way, because One Punch Man started off as a web comic, yes, in Japan, but still got really popular and then got redone and turned into an anime, and also did a lot for like online animators getting massively picked up for its staff. So I think it's cool. It's not necessarily, and I think it's a bit more than a fun fact. And to be fair, also, I do remember a friend of ours being really excited because Noblesse was one of the manhwas that was being adapted, and I don't know where it is. I haven't seen any evidence that it's done or where it is, because I was kind of excited. Noblesse was a pretty I followed it mostly, and will it's on my list of things that are now done that I have no excuse to not catch up on because they were finished. But it was something I used to follow very closely, and then I just didn't have enough time. But now that it's done, I'm gonna try to find a time to binge watch it. So no, I think it's exciting, and it's also, I think, a necessary adaptation for the manga, or for the anime industry. Sorry, to like kind of acknowledge this new fan base, because a lot of the fans, especially the fans outside of Japan of the style, are reading all their comics online, regardless of whether they are uh, Shonen Jump mangas or manhwas that were created by independent artists. And I think it's good on them to like kind of pick this up and start adding it to their industry, because I think it is something that's starting to become more and more a part of the market. And again, with the global pandemic, it's something you can do from home. It's something a lot of people who work kind of more closely will be able to follow up. And I think it falls in a similar category as podcasts, as something that's finally your medium is something you can put more effort, especially if, like a lot of people, it was something you did as a secondary job, but now that your primary job is lost, you might as well put all of your time and effort into it.
Yeah, see, I'm not as excited about this because I didn't actually watch any of these shows. I heard they're mostly like mediocre at best, and in my season of watching less, I'm like, well, I'm not going to bother with things that aren't super good. But you mentioned Noblesse. I know for a fact that one is on Crunchyroll. So if you do want to check out the anime of Noblesse, it is on Crunchyroll. Speaking of anime, Demon Slayer, which is a show that we spoke about in our 2019 Memory Lane episode, I have now since watched the whole show with my brother King Boo, and I really like it. I think it's a really good show. I think it's really well animated. I know you said it's kind of generic, but what it's noteworthy in 2020 because they had an anime film released in theaters in Japan. And I don't know if you heard this, but it broke all these box office records. It's now the highest grossing film of all time in Japan. It's the first film since like Spirited Away had held the title for like 20 years. And it's like the fourth highest grossing movie of 2020 overall. It's the highest grossing animated film of 2020. And I think it's interesting on just a personal level because unlike most anime movies that are kind of like just filler or a story that doesn't matter, what they've done with Demon Slayer is they actually just took a whole story arc and adapted it into a movie. So it actually, the way that the first season, the TV show ends, it leads right into the events of this movie. So that means that like, unless you are following either the manga or the anime show, you really would be lost if you start watching the movie. So the fact that it's so popular tells me that there's obviously a lot of people who watch the show.
Yeah, I mean, I know I've been dismissive of it, but I think it's also because I was trying to curb the hype that was happening because there have been breakout shows who did really well, like Attack on Titan, and then completely failed later on. I don't think Demon Slayer is doing that. I do still feel like it's a little bit generic, but I've watched a few more episodes than I had, and I do acknowledge that there is something more there than just pretty animation. There are good characters and good character moments. I still don't think I still think people went way overboard when they said it was going to be replacing One Piece, and I think the current arcs in One Piece, especially the last chapter, are kind of showing that. But I think, there is a precedent for that in anime movies. Like the end of Evangelion was kind of wrapping up Neon Genesis Evangelion, and there's been a few others that have done similar things. You talked about what we watched the new Broly movie that kind of had that happen as well, and I think that's probably a good way to go. I'm surprised it was the highest selling animated, but then again, not a lot of things came out in 2020, so that kind of measures it up. But yeah, I think it's good news for anime fans, I guess. But also, I'd be interested in knowing how that the release of the movie coincided with COVID and how the rules might have were they different in Japan and what happened. There's definitely a lot of things you could analyze, but overall, Demon Slayer does seem to be holding pretty steady, and that if that movie is any indication, then perhaps it will keep being good.
Yeah, it premiered in Japanese theaters in October, and I do believe like Japan has been out of lockdown for a while. But I don't know, the fact that it became the highest grossing film of all time in the country, despite the global pandemic, that just says something about how crazy people are for that show right now. And the second season was just announced yesterday. So I'm excited. It's coming out later this year. Who knows? Maybe we'll end up talking about it more depth at one point. But kind of speaking about movies in general, 2020 saw this pivot for everything. Like the whole world had to pivot. Every industry had to pivot and transition, doing things differently. And movie theaters and the movie industry kind of had to pivot as well. So we saw a lot of different kind of hybrid release strategies for films in the year 2020. The first one that I saw is that movie studios just sort of kind of gave up and they said, all right, we're just going to sell this movie to a streaming service. So, like, one example I can think of, Coming to America, the sequel to the original Coming to America, was supposed to be released in theaters in December 2020, but the studio just decided to sell the film rights to Amazon Prime, and now it's going to be released in March 2021 as an Amazon Prime exclusive movie. So that's certainly one approach that has been done a handful of times now, just sort of cutting their losses and saying, forget it, we're not even going to bother waiting to release this in theaters, because that's kind of the problem, is that theaters, want to make money because people will go to the theater to see new movies, and the movie studios want to make money because that's their whole thing. And they only really make money when a lot of people are able to go see the movies, which even when theaters are open right now, they're kind of restricted to a certain number of patrons at a time. Do you wish that more studios were taking that approach, Beef Pork Ribs, and just sort of selling off their movies for a high price to like streaming services?
Yes and no. I do think it's a good strategy to go for, and it's definitely I like it better than some of the other solutions like the premium rentals that Mulan had, especially considering how disappointing Mulan ended up being. But at the same time, I understand the kind of downside of it, especially with, I think we touched on this a little bit, different companies who have worked on the movie, but who have, a part of their contract is based on box office, and that needs to be completely renegotiated and redone in these cases. So I think as a customer, obviously, I think this is the solution I like the best, and I wish more people would take as the approach. But I do understand that it's a lot more complicated than just selling off the rights to your movie to, especially when much of the industry around around movies is based on box office sales.
Yeah, and like I agree. I kind of regret paying the amount of money I did to get access to Mulan like 3 months earlier than everybody else. But then you also saw movies like Wonder Woman 1984, which had this hybrid release of being available on a streaming service at no additional cost the same day it was available in theaters. And that was convenient for Americans who had access to paying for HBO Max, but for the rest of us, it just felt like another digital rental. And we've talked a bit about that kind of conflict of, different producers not making their money on the back end and production companies not getting percentages of the box office. But would that be the better approach? Like giving people the option to like watch a movie on the streaming service that you're paying for or in the theater?
I mean, I like that approach better, but again, it is dependent on movie theaters being accessible, and I feel like in a way that's almost a worse option for the production companies because they can say, "Oh yeah, there were some box office profits. Here you can have part of it," but it will never be what it would be if it was fully released. And then it also benefits the people on whose streaming platform it is much more. So, like again, as a customer, I like that a little bit more, I think, than selling the right. Well, no, I think, yeah, I do because I like going to the theater, and I think it's something that I would like to see encouraged, but it still feels a little bad as a kind of as a release, and especially I don't live in the United States, so to me, it really wasn't any different than premium rental, which like
It's
it would be a
expensive.
lot better if it was one way or the other.
Yeah, like these premium. So like that's another option that some movies like Scoob did this year, as they just sort of put it out for premium digital rental on the day that it was meant to be released in theaters. And you know, for a movie like Scoob that's only like an hour and a half long, 25-30 bucks is a lot of money. Even for Wonder Woman 84, like, yeah, the movie was like 2.5 hours long, but it still cost 30-35 bucks. It's like, that's a lot of money for a movie you don't even get to keep.
And it really isn't equivalent to watching it in theaters. Like it, that's. I mean, I think that's the other problem is that I understand that they need the premium rental to be somewhere around the price of one or two movie tickets in order to keep up with profits and with keeping track of the money it's making, and there are reasons around it. But yeah, as the person watching this movie, I okay, I've got a decent sized TV, but I don't have a full sound system. I don't have reclining seats. I don't have, I used to have I used to have a projector and a actual surround sound, in which case it would make it almost worth it for me. But at this time for me, yeah, it really definitely isn't. And yeah, again, something like Scoob probably would not have gone to see it in theaters. Wonder Woman possibly, but then again, it really depends. And this definitely was not the movie theater experience.
I think the option I saw this year that I'd probably encourage the most is like what Bill and Ted Face the Music did, where you could go see it in theaters if theaters were open and you were able to, or you could do the digital premium rental at home. To me, like even when COVID's over, I think giving people that option to watch the movie from home and like figuring out the deals on the back end so everyone still gets their money. I think that'd be the best thing to do because some people might just prefer not going into the theater, and I get that some theater chains are like, but they won't. I guess I'm just speaking from my own preference, like to have that option to like rent it for premium prices at home or go to the theater would be nice.
I still think that having the premium rental date the same as the theater release date is not preferable. I think really there should be a bit of a difference between the two, just to kind of to get people kind of an idea of what it is, because that is something that is pretty common. Like with movie theater, like you won't necessarily immediately go watch a movie. Like some people do, but some people are like waiting to see the reviews or waiting to see what happens, and then I think a lot more people would have not rented a movie like Mulan if there was a little bit more of a first wave going into it. But maybe that's just, again, yeah, I think we're talking mostly of our personal preferences. But and again, we are the customers, and the customer's always right, don't you know?
Exactly. And then of course the movies that are made just for streaming services, they're the ones kind of laughing because their release strategy isn't at all impacted by the pandemic. So, like the Christmas Chronicles 2 with Kurt Russell came out on Netflix in November, just as it would have even if there wasn't a pandemic. So those are certainly the movies that are doing the best in terms of business because there is no, I guess, box office to spread, or the movie theater companies aren't missing out on anything because they wouldn't have seen it anyway. And
Yeah,
it
and
is
they have
weird.
the added benefit of actually keeping true to what the production um, was intended to be looking at, and I think that's something that feels a lot better as somebody watching it and not thinking that, oh, they had to rush things or change things or um, make compromises in order to give us the product they wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I went to a movie theater 4 times in 2020, and of all the movies I watched, even the ones that are like premium rentals, Mulan for the premier access or whatever, I don't think there was any movie I was like entirely happy with. Every movie I saw had something wrong with it, or it didn't live up to my expectations. And I feel like that's the first time that that's ever happened in a year for me. And I don't know if it's because people just saw that, like, yeah, okay, these movies aren't great, we'll just put them out, there's no point waiting on them. Whereas perhaps some of these movies that are now meant to come out in 2021 are actually good movies, and they're not wanting to, kind of like waste them on a small potential audience.
Yeah, but at some point you got to consider the sunk cost fallacy as well. I mean, like, what's the name of the new James Bond movie that had a full press rollout twice now and still isn't being released? I don't think like I understand what you're saying, and I think there's a part of that somewhat that they're like, no, these are good movies, we want to release them big, but the problem is the longer you keep pushing it back and trying to create hype over it, the harder it is to do. And I think you're looking at, like, I think a lot of them are just falling into the sunk cost fallacy that are like, no, we put so much effort into this, we need it to release and to do really well, but I don't know that they will. And I think even though logically I know that even though this movie being released, several months later will not affect its quality, it's a ready product. But there's this part of me that's like, no, I've waited so long, I want it to be better. I feel like you're just building up the expectations without being able to necessarily deliver anymore. And maybe that's part of what happened this year as well. Is you were just so excited to finally see something in theaters, and then you're like, okay.
That's a good point. Yeah, maybe I'm being too harsh. And it's funny because like in preparation for this episode, I like Googled best movies of 2020, and a lot of them I hadn't seen. I'm like, I don't know, I haven't heard of these movies. So, and it's interesting because most of these movies are streaming films. They're movies that were released on either Amazon Prime or Netflix or Disney Plus. So that says something, right? Of course, the best reviewed films of the year are the ones that are actually being released for streaming. So I haven't seen any of these movies, and I've only heard of some of them before yesterday. So The Invisible Man came out in like February, early March before the lockdown started. So it was like one of the only movies that got like a major theatrical release this year. and I heard good things about it. It sounds like it's a good update to the concept, and I don't know, did you hear anything good about The Invisible Man?
I did not even know it existed, though I could be curious to see what it's done. But The Invisible Man is such an odd story, and one that does need. If you look at what the book is and what a lot of the media built around that character is, it would not do very well in the current climate. So I'd be interested in knowing what the update is, but I had never heard of it.
There's a movie that premiered at all like the film festivals this year, and they were all online this year, called Minari, that I want to go watch because it's about a Korean family that moves to Arkansas in the 80s, and it's about them trying to essentially live the immigrant life and pursue the American dream. And it stars Stephen Yeun, who some people would know from The Walking Dead, and it is like a movie where they're mostly speaking in Korean. So apparently it's getting like a US theatrical release in like this month in 2021. I don't know what that means for Canada, but it sounds interesting. I'm definitely interested in seeing it. Is anything about that's interesting to you?
It's a Korean film. It's not. I don't know. I it's this weird thing where like I haven't seen a lot of Korean films, but the ones I've seen have been really good. But probably mostly because I have to hear a lot of good things about a film not in French or English in order to get me motivated to go see it. So well, it sounds like a good concept and interesting. So I might be interested in it, but it's not much more than I already am. And to be fair, I don't go to the movie theater nearly as much as you do. So who knows? Maybe it'd be something that I would check out, but possibly.
There's one movie that came out for Amazon Prime this year that sounded interesting. It was called One Night in Miami, and it was about like a one night in Miami in the 60s. And I don't think it's based on a real event, but it supposes what would happen if Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, and these two other uh, African American figures who I think were musicians. I didn't even recognize their names, but people from that time period would probably recognize who they are. People who know American history better than I do. But it's this kind of like fictionalized account of like, oh, like what if these four figures from history all congregate and like spent a night kind of conversing and talking about American society with each other. And it's directed by Regina King, who up until now is mostly known for being an actress. So apparently it's her directorial debut, and apparently she does a good job. So I don't know. Beef over ribs, does that perk your interest?
Yeah, actually, I do remember seeing like a few trailers for it and being a little excited, but maybe also because I haven't seen that many trailers recently, and so it's hard to get excited for things when you don't necessarily see things. It's the last trailer that I keep getting slightly excited for is Dune because every time I see the trailer, I'm like, oh, this could work, and then we're immediately worried about some of the details of the things. But that one did seem, at the very least, an interesting look at. Uh, I like historical fiction, like in the sense of like things that alternative history could be very interesting. It also has a high risk of falling into kind of a pandering blaxploitation movie, but I feel like those don't really fly under the radar anymore, so probably not. Probably
A
be
lot of
pretty
people,
exciting to see.
a lot of people put Soul, the Pixar movie, on their top 10 movies of the year, and it was originally supposed to go in theaters, but ended up being just thrown on Disney Plus on Christmas Day. So I haven't seen it yet. I wasn't particularly interested, but now that the people are saying it's good, I'm wondering maybe I should watch it.
I mean, again, top 10 movies that came out in 2020 isn't a huge pool to pick from. Uh, I can't remember if we did an episode on it, but I think upon looking back on it, there are definitely very good moments in it, and some of it that is, Pixar doing what Pixar does best, which is, making you feel feels that you normally wouldn't think you would get from an animated movie. But I definitely, I remember when we talked about Wonder Woman 1984 and like how the plot holes didn't pull you out of the movie. Soul definitely pulled me out of the movie a lot with its plot holes. So I don't know if I'd put it really that high as a movie.
All right, well, there you go, guys. And 3 Netflix movies kind of were on the lists that I saw. One of them was called Mank, which is like a reference to this writer who worked on the original Citizen Kane movie. Apparently, he worked with Orson Welles making it, and it's kind of like about his story in Hollywood, and it's in black and white, and Gary Oldman's the lead character. It seems I've never seen Citizen Kane. I know I'm a terrible movie fan for saying that, but this movie about this guy who was involved with making it kind of makes me interested in like seeing it. So, what about you, Beef Pork Ribs?
Well, I have seen Citizen Kane. Sorry. Though to be fair, I only watched it like 2 years ago. Um, no, it was more than well. Anyways, but I saw it fairly later in life. But I think that yeah, I'd be interested in it, and especially if I don't know. You always have to be careful with like black and white movies because I feel like if you're trying to go for like a timepiece or a time period, you need to have the black and white actually add something rather than be a gimmick. So I think it could be interesting. But I mean, Gary Oldman is quite capable of carrying a movie with a good performance, and especially for historical figures or historical fiction or kind of based on true events. So I'd be interested in it. And I mean, Citizen Kane was there's a lot around that movie, not just as being a grand movie, but about what the story was telling and its time in in history. So if they kind of focus on that, I'd be really interested in seeing maybe a deeper look at it.
Another Netflix movie, The Trial of Chicago 7, which apparently is based on a true story of this thing that actually happened in Chicago in like the 1970s. It's got a big ensemble cast, everyone from Frank Langella to Joseph Gordon-Levitt to Sacha Baron Cohen to Eddie Redmayne. It looks really intriguing. I might actually watch this one on Netflix. Based on that, does any of that intrigue you?
I actually became a little more interested in that movie because of a YouTube channel uh, called Legal Eagle that kind of like I started watching a lot of the videos around the end of the Trump presidency and the election, and that was part of he talked about the trial a little bit, and I thought it was interesting because it's a free speech issue, which I think is something that could be very interesting to learn about. And honestly, out of all of them, all the movies you just mentioned, I think that's the one that I'd be the most interested in watching. Mostly because of some of the implications and the subject matter, but also um, a huge fan of Sacha Baron Cohen. Anything he's in, I would at least give more interest than a regular movie.
And then the final movie that seemed to be on a lot of these lists was also a Netflix film. It was called Da Five Bloods. And it's a Spike Lee movie, and it's kind of it follows like these 2 time periods. You see one perspective of these young African Americans fighting in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and then it kind of flashes forward to them now living as veterans. And I think partially why this movie got a lot of buzz, of course, like Spike Lee's a very prolific filmmaker, but also it's Chadwick Boseman's kind of final performance. He plays one of the characters at war, and everyone fell in love with that actor and was really upset when he passed away last year. So it's hard to say if it's like a Dark Knight situation where like the movie has acclaim and clout because it has a beloved actor who passed away in it, or if it's actually just a really good movie. I do plan on checking it at some point.
I mean, I think it might depend. For me, like I once went on a Vietnam War movie binge, and it was not a pleasant experience. Not because the movies were bad; they were mostly very good movies. But it's a very dark time to look at in history. But it does sound promising, at the very least. I think it's one of those I would have probably never went to see in theaters, but as it is on Netflix, there's a good chance I might check it out.
And of the movies I actually did see in 2020, I think the one I was probably least disappointed with was either Sonic the Hedgehog or Bill and Ted 3.
I totally forgot Sonic the Hedgehog came out in 2020. But I have to wholeheartedly agree with you there. I was very pleasantly surprised by Sonic. It was a much better movie than it had any right to be, and I think Bill and Ted just hit the right notes. It wasn't. It
Ah,
was. It
clever.
didn't. It didn't blow my mind, but it did what I was expecting out of a Bill and Ted movie, and it closed it off rather nicely. And Keanu Reeves is a treasure. It was a good movie.
In terms of TV shows for 2020, we've already talked about The Mandalorian and how much we love the second season that aired in the latter part of 2020. But some other shows that, for some reason, were very popular in 2020. Tell me if you've watched these ones before, Cribs. We have The Last Dance.
Never seen it, and out of the ones on the list, that's the only one I have no idea what it is.
The Last Dance is this kind of like documentary series about Michael Jordan and his career in the NBA. It originally aired on ESPN, and then it was later put on Netflix, and it was like top trending when it came in on Netflix. So I'm not a basketball fan. I mostly know Michael Jordan because of Space Jam. So I'd be mostly interested in watching it if they'd like touch on Space Jam, to be honest.
I doubt they will, but I had more or less the same reaction as you when you mentioned it, so probably not.
Better Call Saul. It's not a Netflix show, but apparently this season that aired in 2020 was like a really good one. And I think you said you watched this show.
It was a very good one. I got really upset when I got at the end of it that there wasn't another season. I really like Better Call Saul. I think it was a really good set of characters to focus on for a spin-off of Breaking Bad. Well, it's more prequel than a spin-off. But I really actually love that show. I think as it develops, it might even be, to me personally, better than Breaking Bad was. Though that still is a high bar and might remain to be seen. But it definitely it did the opposite of what Korra did as a spin-off. It took all the characters I do care about and started giving me more with them, as opposed to taking out all the characters I care about and making it another show. So I would recommend anybody who was a fan of Breaking Bad to watch it, though I will admit, if you haven't seen Breaking Bad, it's not a bad show, and you don't need to have seen it to understand what's going on, but a lot of the characters, you wouldn't necessarily understand why they're being focused on.
I think we talked about this earlier in the year, but when the pandemic started in March, Netflix revealed the Tiger King show to the world, and it was everywhere for like a month. Like everyone was talking about it, everyone was watching it. I remember Zoom backgrounds that were like Tiger King themed. But then it kind of just disappeared, and I never actually watched it. But I'm curious, did you engage in Tiger King activity?
I was trying so hard to have nothing to do with that show, and then either when we were recording a podcast episode or when I was playing D&D, Mjolnir started watching with her roommates, and it grabs you. It is entertaining. In the way that watching a train wreck is. It just keeps piling on, and when you think it can't get any worse, any more ridiculous, it does, and you definitely think. I found myself thinking so many times, there's no way this could possibly be real. And then you start doing some research and you're like, nope, these all real people. This is what they did. This documentary crew actually filmed this documentary as things were unfolding. And it, it is, I mean, I think everybody agrees. It's just gripping trash, but it's like a train wreck. You can't look away, and once you start watching it, you just need to know what happens, and you get ultimately extremely disappointed that almost nobody got the comeuppance you hoped they would get.
Well, I'm glad I didn't get caught up in it, and it seems like it's mostly gone away now. So let's just ignore it. But a Netflix
Good
show
idea.
that did get received very well this past fall, apparently like broke streaming records, which has admittedly like made me more curious to watch it, is The Queen's Gambit, which is a show about this female chess player. So have you seen The Queen's Gambit?
I've seen like parts of episodes because our roommate watched part of it. But honestly, all I remember is Jojen Reed. I know that's not his name. That's the character he plays in Game of Thrones. I don't know his name. He's the British kid in the Maze Runner, but with a cowboy hat and a mustache and an open-chested shirt, and it just made me laugh a lot. But I mean, beyond that, I mean, apparently it has made a lot of people consider or start playing chess, which I guess is cool. But I don't know if I were. I feel like it's one of those. You know the classification non-fighting fighting animes.
Yep. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, like it's the Shogeki no Soma of Netflix, basically. Not on that quite that level, but I feel like that's where it's at. It has that feeling where it's like definitely, yeah, it seems to have good stakes. And I'm assuming since it did so well, either people who watch it just have no idea what a non-fighting fighting anime is and don't know what good TV is, or it has good characterization and good stakes around the games of chess. But I also know very few shows that actually are in that format outside of anime. So maybe it's just signs of good things to come for that.
Yeah, you make a good point. That is actually very common in anime to have like a battle series around gambling or card games or shogi or mahjong or like, all these.
Yeah, it's basically it has the potential. I haven't seen it much enough to know, but it felt like it had the potential to be something like Shogeki no Soma or Yu-Gi-Oh, or at best Kaiji Ultimate Survivor, which is a great show about gambling um, and gambling addiction. But I feel like, yeah, if I can understand why it would be successful if it does that, where it builds up both personal stakes and technical stakes in a fight, a battle of wits, which is ultimately what those shows do best. So I can see why, if that's what it does, it could be something I might check out and would be really good. But also, it just might be that there aren't a lot of TV shows like that, so people are just like latching onto it.
So now we are in 2021, and of course, we're looking towards the future. As I kind of shared at the beginning of the episode, when I think about my own situation, like now working from home, it's like I've lived it. I understand what it looks like, and I can kind of live life with that in mind. And I think the entertainment industry and just the world in general is kind of pivoting that way as well. So we do have some movies that are meant to get wide releases in March 2021 with Godzilla versus King Kong and Raya and the Last Dragon from Disney. So it is entirely possible for us to start actually seeing more movies coming out for everyone to see. And as things hopefully get better with the virus, to have things like return to normal more and more. But for 2020, like, thank goodness for streaming, that there's lots of great content being made available. And thank goodness that there's online platforms that make kind of allowing people to gather virtually a thing. I'm certainly, it's not, if you think of 2020 as like the start of this decade, it's not exactly the strongest start, but I am hopeful as we kind of journey on through 2021.
Yeah, I think I am obviously very excited to get things, back online and back to things that are more normal. But at the same time, it's we've done well, and but it is a strange paradox that yes, this technology and interconnectingness makes it easier to bear the pandemic, but it's also the very reason why it kind of was able to spread so fast. Not so much the internet media, but the other parts of what makes globalization a thing. But maybe that's just the social teacher in me speaking. And also, let's be honest, the 1930s probably had an overall worst beginning to it, so maybe not the worst decade ever.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
So now it's time to go into the Bat Jar and find out what we're going to talk about next week. I mean,
And then
before
after you pick something out, you add Avatar: The Last Airbender.
right. So while I have my hand in here, do we want to just do an episode about what we're going to be doing or what is coming out in 2021, or should we just kind of not waste our breath talking about things that might not happen?
I think we should just honestly do think that maybe having more of these kind of like updates we have at the beginning of some episodes saying, well, this is now releasing soon, so we might look at it, is a better way to do things. Just give the news as they come out, because there's no real point in planning it out if it's going to be this irregular.
Fair enough. Okay, so I have pulled out Disney movies from the years 2000 to 2010. So Beef Pork Ribs, for your knowledge and for people who've been more recent listeners of the podcast, we have talked about Disney movies from different eras. We talked about the golden age of Disney from like the 30s until I think it was the end of the end of the mid 60s or something. And then we did the Disney Renaissance, which is like 80s to 90s. So this is now talking about all the Disney movies and ranking the Disney movies that came up between 2000 and 2010, which some would argue is probably like one of the worst eras for Disney. So this could be painful.
A quick wiki check. It goes from Fantasia 2000 to Princess and the Frog. But I think there are some. This is like all movies released by Disney
in theaters, like they're animated movies, like not live action.
Okay, this makes a lot of things a lot better. Although, actually, looking at this, remember the Titans? That was pretty good, and I don't know about this being an entirely terrible decade. I'm just Emperor's New Groove. That was the thing.
Okay, well,
let's
not.
Empire. Never mind.
Let's,
okay, but I think this will be an interesting one to look through. But I almost wish some of the live actions were included, because it was a good decade for live action movies.
Oh yeah, Miracle, best sports movie ever. Anyway, come back to the Bachelor podcast next week when we talk about the Disney animated movies from the 2000s. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
And I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
Catch you on the flip side.
And have a lovely post-Valentine Day.